Okay, thank you for that very enlightening talk. And now we have one more speaker for this morning, Professor Semi Oh from the University of Michigan. Please welcome Professor Oh.
Thank you, and I'd like to thank everyone who's involved in the organization of this colloquium. And a special thanks to Professor Chi-Soo Kim for putting together an event on such an important topic. Today I will talk about the funeral of King Kojong, who was the last king of the Joseon dynasty and lived through the colonial period. He came to the throne in 1863 and became an emperor in 1897, abdicated in 1907, and after the annexation by Japan in 1910, he died in 1919. So I am a cultural historian of modern Korea. So I can't really, claim to be among the, company of the experts in Uyghur that you heard, from today. But my job today is to talk about the kind of changes that were put in place in the funeral practice for Kojong and the record-keeping practice, in the aftermath of the funeral, so we can all reflect upon what Uyghur meant for the Joseon monarchy and the dynasty by asking what did the colonial government did not want. So we'll take a little bit of a detour. The intervention that was made by the Japanese colonial government in 1919 was not accidental, because the funeral actually took place at the backdrop of a very momentous event in Korean history. This is known as the March 1st movement, and if you are familiar with Korean history, this event may not be an unfamiliar one. It was a mass protest movement when thousands and tens of thousands of Koreans took to the street asking for Korea's independence. And this became a catalyst for the policy shift in Japanese colonial government in 1920. This event took place, as the name suggests, on March 1st in 1919, and Kojong's funeral was on March the 3rd, only 2 days after the outbreak of the March 1st movement. So we need to ask, why the colonial government went ahead with such an important occasion, the funeral of King Kojong, and what changes that were put in place, and how they try to keep the kind of political potential of even, making things worse, for the March 1st movement. The political stake was really high. So we want to take a look at the kind of things that happened for Kojong's funeral, so that we can ask about what the changes made in Uyghur, and through that we can talk about the importance of Uyghur that existed in Korean history. So I'll first briefly discuss the funeral, how it was planned and organized by the Japanese colonial government, and I'll spend most of my presentation to discuss the funeral procession from the Tok's Palace to the burial site, and then compare the photographic representations of the funeral to those of Uyghur to see how this new medium produced a specific kind of historical account, and how the writing of history through photographic images altered the significance of age-old ritual for the royal family. Rites and rituals, as you heard today, occupied an important place in the Joseon dynasty as a means of governance equal to the laws. It propagated new Confucian values through practice and ensured the continuation of the ideological stability of the dynasty. It also had a role in visualizing the ideal principles of the dynasty through visual and material symbols. Its routes of communications were therefore multiple and multifaceted, all of which contributed to the production of specific practices as well as language of symbols, customs, and performances. Royal funerals were no exception in this regard, and exclusive rituals designated only to royal families involved prolonged duration and elaborate rituals. Royal funerals, as Professor Yi mentioned earlier, one of the 5 rituals, normally took place in 3 stages. The first phase, immediately following the death of the person, lasted until the corpse was prepared and placed in the mortuary hall. During this time, the succession matters were handled and the gravesite was prepared. The second phase involved the departure of the bird from the mortuary hall. Yes. A little closer. Can you hear me better? Okay. I can hear myself, and I think you can hear me, so please let me know. Just raise your hand, if you can hear me. So the first phase is, it follows immediately after the death, succession matters, decided, and the mortuary hall prepared. And the second phase involved the departure of the bird from the mortuary hall to the gravesite, as well as the burial itself. And the third phase was a 3-year-long period of mourning and the ancestor shrine. And this is when the record keeping is mostly done. Each phase of the royal funeral was strictly observed by the instruction detailed in the supplementary treatise on funerary rites, 국조 상례보편. When the king died, a bureau called 도감 was established and officials were selected to serve in that agency. Under the direction of the prime minister, 3 branches of the bureau were established: 국장도감, that oversaw the entirety of the funeral rites, and 빈전도감, that managed the mortuary hall, dressing of the corpse, and funerary clothing, and 상림도감, that was responsible for the burial site. The funeral was preceded in the sequence of the establishment of togam, preparation of the mortuary hall, donning of the mourning garment for the chief mourner, usually the son, eldest son, departure of the coffin, lowering of the coffin, bringing back of the mortuary tablet to the palace, and finally disbanding of the togam. Gojong died on January 21st, 1919, at the age of 67, in his residence of the Deoksu Palace. Gyeongbok Palace was not his primary residence at that time. His funeral was being prepared in accordance with the royal rites immediately after his death. But an edict was issued on January 27th stating the necessity of a state funeral for him. The edict came from actually Japanese colonial government. The edict said, I quote, "The funeral of the great King Yi, recipient of the Supreme Order, Daehuni, shall be a state funeral," unquote. In this, Gojong is referred to as the Great King Yi, a title given to him after the dethronement, like Iwang, Itaewang, actually, instead of Gojong, his reign title, or Emperor Gojong, Gojong Hwangjae, as he was known since the foundation of the Hahn Empire in 1897. It is a term that connotes the demoted status of Gojong as a nominal king, devoid of any significance of the formal political power from the Joseon dynasty or the Hahn Empire. More interestingly, he is referred to as a recipient of the Supreme Order, Daehuni, a highest rank given in the imperial bureaucracy of Japan. It was a mixed bag of message that both honored Gojong as a king who deserved a state funeral and demoted him from the position of the sovereign. And the whole funeral process would be orchestrated to delicately balance this act of preserving the nominal position of the king and desacralizing him at the same time. So when Japan intervened, the funeral was arranged by the Office of Funeral Rites in the Imperial Household Agency and in accordance with the Japanese imperial rites. Instead of the 3 branches of Togam that was normally established for royal funerals, Jugam was established, Ojang Jugam, Binjeon Honjeon Jugam, and Sangneung Jugam, under the directives of the Imperial Household Agency of Japan. So in this slide on your left, you see the mortuary hall that was prepared in accordance with the Joseon laws and rights. And then when Japan intervened, they actually changed the whole thing in Japanese style. And these offices were headed by Japanese officials with the exception of the vice chief of funerary rites, Jo Dong-yun, who appears in this photograph walking behind the chief of the funerary rites, Ito Hirokuni. The part of the funeral that mostly followed the Joseon rites was the procession from the Deoksu Palace to the Hongrung, the burial site in Namyangju. But as you see here, it also added some of the idiosyncratic, or some would say modern, elements, such as Japanese army, naval vessels, marching band, and transport by railway. So this is a scene where the Japanese officials are leading the funeral procession. And this is the bird, passing by the Keiji newspaper building. And I'll actually come back to this photograph. And here's another scene of the funeral participants with the Japanese police, and army guarding the funeral, and here is the army, in participant along with the mourners in the procession. In the end, the funeral of Kojong took place on March 3rd, with Japan taking over the whole ritual, and in much less than 5-month period usually given for the royal funeral. One of the most important tasks of the Togam, the agency responsible for royal funerals, was the publication of 의궤. Typically, royal funerals produce 3 의궤, published by 3 Togam mentioned. So the 의궤s were 국장 도감 의궤, 빈전 도감 의궤, 산능 도감 의궤. Since no Togam was established for Kojong's funeral, Jugam was in charge of publishing 의궤. So we have 3 의궤 published by Jugam, Kojong 태황제 어장 주감 의궤, we see here, 고정 태황제 빈전 혼전 주감 의궤, and 고정 태황제 산능 주감 의궤. Since the funerary rites themselves were altered quite a bit for Kojong, the content of the 의궤 also differ from the previous ones and tend to lack in its rigor of detail and meticulous record keeping. However, one major difference for Kojong's 의궤 is the lack of visual depiction of the funerary procession, as mentioned, 반차도. In place of 반차도, only a diagram of placement and procession appeared in text standing for images, and they gave information as to who the participants were and where they were placed in the procession, but we don't see the kind of information that can be easily transmitted or impressed through visual means such as the color and the types of the clothing, what they were wearing. This is what it would have been looked like, and this is 반차도 from Myeongsong, Queen Myeongsong's 의궤. She's the queen of Kojong who deceased in 1896. And when we look at this, we can kind of think about what this whole 반차도 meant, how this 반차도 was supposed to be read. And as Professor Yi showed the kind of vertical composition of separate pages, making one painting, and Professor Park also showed how 반차도 was moving, but in reality, 반차도 does not move. We have to flip the pages. It's in the book form. So 의궤 is importantly done in a book form. So each page of 의궤 contains only a partial view, like this, of the procession. And as the reader turns the page, he or she would follow the procession from the beginning to the end. These fragmented views were put together only by the act of the reading and by completing the book. Reading book is a linear experience, and through book reading, the procession is experienced to the reader as a moving image. The spectator of a procession in actuality would be in a static position, so the time of the movement is determined by the procession itself. On the contrary, this visual rendition depended upon the spectator reader to create an illusion of movement by turning the pages of the book. Here, the temporal experience of the book reading is supposed to correspond to the temporal movement of the procession and simulate a time movement. However, this does not mean that Pantada create a real-time experience of proto-cinema. The background of the image is a blank space, and I think it's an important aspect. Professor Jungmann mentioned whether the landscapes were real landscape or ideal landscape, and when you have a blank space like that, the image text without the context was designed to be applicable to all places and time, and I think quite frankly to be universal. In other words, the descriptions of the procession painting or the diagram were intended to be more prescriptive because correctness of the ritual was the most important thing. So they not only recorded what took place, but they also wanted to give a model to their future posterity how things are done. Although these visual records based on singular events in history, these rituals and ceremonies were repeatedly occurring events, and therefore the purpose of recording was to serve as a reference for the posterity. This notion of repeatability collapses the temporal boundary between the past and the future, and the ritual serving as a model renders itself as an eternal event, however paradoxical it may sound. For Ko-jung's funeral, a more prominent form of visual record came in photography. We have many different types of photography chronicling the funeral, but one in particular that I like to pay attention is this, the Deoksu state funeral album, the Deoksu 국장 화첩. This was published shortly after the funeral by a Keijo newspaper company in 1919. However, it more or less served as the official visual record for the funeral. This photo album has interesting composition. It has, in the beginning, portraits of Ko-jung, as if to introduce the biographical information about him. So here's a photo of him in the middle with his family, and here's a photo of him, wearing, military uniform to show him as a modern monarch, and then. It also contains photos of the Japanese officials, who were involved in planning and implementation of the funeral. And then it talks about, here's another view of the officials, and it talks about the event in a chronological order. This particular photo shows a view of the crowd gathered in front of the Taehan Gate of the Deoksu Palace on January 24th. It was the day when the chief mourner, Sun Jung, donned the mourning garment. And then the actual funeral itself, this is a collage view of the funeral, the military marching band in procession, and the army on the top. And here is the bird leaving the Taehan Gate with the mourners donning the traditional garment. And here is a view of the crowd viewing the bird passing by, and you see the Keijo newspaper building in the background. These images offer a documentary view of the funeral, so realism was supposed to be the most important aspect. However, I would argue that what photography achieved in depicting the funeral event was the desacralization of the ritual by turning it into an event in the linear continuum of history. History here is presented in a secularized form as its relevance only mattered in the real time of the present. And photography also produced memory. Therefore, in place of the lost sense of eternality that we saw in Uyghur, we see by the singularity of event created by photography, a new sense of permanence was created, and this is the kind of memory and nostalgia that I will talk about. Unlike the eternality of time that Uyghur depicts, the photo album emphasizes the presentness of the event. So we have an example here. This page in the photo album shows a special edition of Mail Shinbo, the official gazetteer of the Japanese colonial government, announcing the death of Ko-jung, side by side with the photograph of the crowd gathered in front of the Taehan Gate. The date of the special edition publication, along with the date and the time of Ko-jung's death, make it a singular event, real and historical. However, the realism created by photography and journalism seems to be mediated by the collage of the image. The photograph accompanying the death announcement of Kojong depicts the crowd gathered in front of the Toksu Palace. So we can summarize that the photograph was taken after the fact the newspaper was reporting, and as well as the reporting itself. Excuse me. But placed on the same page of the album, the moment of the crowd gathering is described as a reaction to the death of Kojong and as a simultaneous event to the news, when in fact they had a cause and effect relationship. By reporting two non-synchronous events side by side, the photo album is telling the story from a retrospective perspective of knowing what took place before and after the announcement of his death. In other words, while the newspaper inserts create a sense of real-time experience, it was done through an editorial intervention as of an omniscient perspective. This shows that while realism is an important aspect of photography, photographs did not simply report, but explained, or more precisely, narrated a story. This sense of narrativity is achieved by arranging photographs in chronological order. The biographical photos of Kojong describe his life before death. With the announcement of his death in male Shinbo, we see the photographs chronicling the funeral as an event unfolding with specific information as to when, where, and how it took place and who participated. The narrativity here contrasts with the time movement image of Pantado in Uige as it offers more historical narrative. This is only made possible by publishing the photo in a book form as a collection, as a photo album, which offers a similar viewing experience as the book reading, and individual photographs only gain meaning in relation to each other, what came before and what came after, rather than simply offering a sense of what happened through the descriptive snapshot of the event. In other words, storytelling is the most important function of the photo album. So let me show you some comparative examples and other photographs or visual depictions. This is La Domenica del Corriere, if I can pronounce it correctly, an Italian newspaper that reported the funeral of Kojong with an image of Jugamma leading the procession. In this, one iconic image stands in for the entire event, rather than telling the event as a narrative sequence of many components. And this photograph has referentiality to the actual event itself, not to the other images in relation to it. And this was one of the photos that we looked at before. This is actually taken by a UPA reporter residing in Seoul at that time. His name is Albert W. Taylor. And this particular photograph depicts the bird leaving the Toksu Palace at 8 a.m. in the morning and passing by the Keijo Nippo building, time-specific, place-specific. However, unlike the photographs of the Toksu State Funeral photo album, which were taken from a photographer in a slightly elevated position overlooking the procession, we can tell that the photographer here, the reporter himself, was standing behind the troops. So we see in an almost a voyeuristic view of the event from someone who did not have a privileged position of an unobstructed view. And in this one, the same photograph by Albert Taylor, we see one of the bird carriers slightly unbalanced because he is wiping sweat or tear off of his face, and the streetcar position parallel to the bird heightens a sense of capturing the moment by the photographer rather than presenting iconic images of the funeral procession. Taylor's photographs offer a sense of urgency, and we get a little more sense of motion and movement in this one than the panoramic view of the procession that we saw earlier in the Toksu photo album. What is conveyed here is a sense of being there, a sense of reporting the event as it was taking place. And although these photographs were published in the newspapers after the fact, the sense of eyewitnessing was the most important element than the sense of telling what happened from a retrospective perspective, as in Toksu album. These were fragmented views of the event whose purpose was to testify to the actuality of the event rather than to explain the process how the event took place. Toksu album is different from journalistic photographs in that it created a retrospective story of not simply what the funeral was, but rather what the funeral meant. Narrativity here is an interventional activity, not something inherent in an event, and it constructs reality rather than reflecting the reality. Just to illustrate my point, here is some thumbnail view of photos of King Yi's funeral, 이태왕 전하장의 사진첩 in the care of Seoul National University Museum. It may not be easy to make out, but what you see if I go through like 6 pages of this thumbnail view is that some of the scenes are photographed multiple times, and the sequence actually repeats. That means this is an unedited version of the same photograph that we see in the Toksu album, done by multiple photographers. So what this illustrates is that the Toksu photo album was a very conscious editorial effect, therefore an interventional activity, and it illustrates the narrative is a simulated reality told from the perspective of the editorial voice. In this retrospective narrative collection, the funeral photographs render the funeral is rendered as event, a singular event in the freeze frame of photography and the narrative of recollection. Here, the eternality of history achieved by ritual, as we saw in Uige, was turned into the virtual memory and nostalgia. Like the relics sitting in the museum, the funeral as an event and media event only harken back to the past that relived itself in the present as memory, not as an event that can resurrect itself. It can be repeated in the present. Here, repeatability gives way to singularity, the sacred to the secular, and eternity to memory. And I would like to illustrate this point and conclude by showing 3 photographs of the gates of Hongneung, the burial site for Kojong, and actually Queen Myeongsang. All 3 photographs featured at the gate of Hongneung, but they all tell different stories. This first photograph depicts the bird arriving at the gate, a perspectival view of the procession that signals a moment of arrival in the long continuum of time staged by the funeral procession. And the second photograph here depicts a slightly more disarrayed view. The crowd is more dispersed, and so the gate becomes the focal point of the photograph, and the narrative content of this photograph becomes the place, the Hongneung, not the moment of the event. Nevertheless, both photographs situate the place of Hongneung in the event of Kojong's funeral. Unlike the first 2, this third photograph depicts a view of the gate with no indication of the funeral event or any other context. This contextual void offers no sense of event, but instead depicts a sense of timelessness in the stillness of the landscape. The only sense of time is hinted with the trees lined up toward the vanishing point in the horizon. So this frozen moment in that passing of the time shows Hongneung in a recollecting, reminiscent, and reflective mood. Here I would like to mention the crowd that we saw in the previous photograph. While they were depicted as simply as spectators then, it was a spectator crowd who transformed themselves as a public, who demanded for Korea's independence and joined the March 1st movement. So this photograph that dilutes the collective possibility of the crowd and individual nostalgia is a desacralization of history through personal memory and an alienation from history because that history only exists in memory. Nostalgia and memory are therefore a means through which history is secularized and personalized, therefore not a denial of history, but the denial of its eternal potential through ritual. Thus, we can talk about the event and media event of Kojong's funeral as a strategy of history writing that disavowed its mythology. That is to say, the changes made in documentary tradition from Uige to photography was in a sense a colonizing process whose goal was not to deny Korea history or even a tradition, but a specific kind of give a specific kind of history that's desacralized the ever-repeating cycle of the ritual and its endowment of power to its monarchy. Thank you very much.